Yesterday, I tested a Canyon Grail with the new DT Swiss gravel fork at the Traka here in Girona, Spain in the pouring rain, and the 40 mil suspension fork absolutely improved the experience. Joining models from RockShox, Fox, MRP, Cane Creek, and Cannondale, this new DT Swiss 132-1 is a 40 mil fork that for the remainder of 2025 is exclusive to Canyon. How is this fork different than all the others out there? How does it feel to ride and to race? And is suspension even worth the trade-offs in weight and complexity when it comes to gravel bikes? I'll get into all of that here. Here in Girona, I spoke to people from both DT Swiss and Canyon about both the philosophy and all of the testing that went into the design of this fork. A air sprung fork, positive, negative, and adjustable rebound at the bottom. Also, I'll give you a walk through the service that DT Swiss suggests you do or have a mechanic do every 50 hours. We'll put that at the end. But first, let's jump into the madness that was the Traka in Girona. There are a number of different distances at the Traka, starting with the Mega 560, the 360, the raciest 200, and then the 100, which is what we did. On paper, it doesn't sound like too much. 100 kilometers, about 4,000 feet of climbing. Conditions, though, were a bear. It started to sprinkle right at the start, and then it was in between a full-on downpour and a drizzle for most of the day.
It's not gonna rain until this afternoon, so we're good.
That's heavy rain as well.
This review will focus on the fork because the bike is otherwise the same. Part of why Canyon worked with DT on this fork was to have the geometry remain unchanged when going from a rigid fork to this, in terms of not just the stack, but even the trail figure. In addition to the 40 millimeters of travel, there's also a lockout actuated by a thumb switch. You can press it when in the drops or pull up on that switch when on the tops, and it just cycles through. Off, on, off, on. The benefit to this is that it's easy to access while riding. Other forks have lockouts on the crown, which is all fine and good, except if it's rigid and you want to switch it into fully active as you're coming into some rough stuff, that's exactly the wrong time to take your hands off the handlebars. So having a switch that you can activate, wherever your hands happen to be on the bars, that's a positive thing. I had the thing open almost the entire race. The ride started out with a pretty stiff paved climb when it was still, 1,000 plus of us clogging the streets just outside of Girona. And then for most of the day, it was on what would normally be dirt or gravel, but it was more like a muddy, rocky luge up and down the mountainside. So I just left the thing open.
Rain feels pretty nice. It's long form cyclocross. Yeah.
The fork felt great in two ways. One, when it was locked out, it felt not just the rigidity, but the handling, because the geo is the same as before, felt like a rigid gravel bike, which for me, when I'm on pavement, is how I want it to feel. I don't like a saggy front end, and I don't like a really heavy front end. So this did not have either of those attributes. When riding seated, which is the majority of the time in a 4-hour gravel race, I wasn't sure if the suspension was locked out a couple times because it wasn't overly squishy, and I had to stand up and look down and press on the bars a bit to see if it was moving, which in fact it was. So that's both a positive and negative thing. The positive is that it doesn't feel squishy or sluggish. The downside is that there's no visual to know whether you're locked out or not. And since the lever just cycles through, it's not a binary off or on thing. Again, you press it like that, open, closed, open, closed. Or when up here, pulling up, locks and unlocks. But there's no way to tell visually which position it's in. The fork's not magic with a bit of sag. It's just a little over 30 mil. So still getting bounced around a bit, but I was so glad to have suspension for those descents, where I'm still pretty squeamish, both from breaking my arm and the tenderness and lack of control, but also just the psychology of I'm just kind of squeamish coming down hills now. when it's rough like that. So I was delighted to have that. Then when we got onto the flats, just riding along JRA on both the gravel roads or the tighter, very tame but tight single track, was happy to have just a little bit of give on the fronts. And again, it didn't feel like the handling was compromised. Since there are already a number of gravel forks out there and most of them are 40 mil, why design a whole new 40 mil fork? I spoke to Matthias Orich, the product manager for both the Grail and the Grizzle, about that. So Matthias, there are a number of gravel forks already out there on the market.
Yes, there are. Why
did you not use a RockShox or a Fox or another fork?
Yeah, first of all, they are still doing great products, and we did work with SRAM or RockShox for the Grizzle already. We had nice experiences with these forks. Then it came down the requirements of a geometry corrected fork, because we think we know a lot about bike geometry, and it works pretty well for our rigid forks already. And then we were pretty clear of the requirements, how that fork, the suspension fork, had to look like from a geometry standpoint. And so we decided we need something new, which will adapt to the geometry of the bike and handles like a rigid fork. And you could, from the pure bike handling side of things, you could just swap out and it feels very much the same. And then we had this big requirement of cable integration. That's for all of our bikes, it's more or less a standard requirement. Only for the budget bikes we tend to do external cables still, but for the premium bikes it's pretty clear for us that you want to have these sleek optics of integrated cables. And there we did talk to a lot of manufacturers of forks. But then DT was very open in adapting to our requirements, and they were really keen to try it out because that's something completely new.
Tell me more about the fork geometry.
Yeah, the fork rake is pretty different in between all these different forks. That's more philosophy you want to follow. We follow the philosophy, the bigger the fork rake, the more you can play with a slacker head tube angle, and that balance is like something that you really have to have in close eye. We built up a complete bike where you could adapt every angle you could wish for, like head tube angle. You could play around with a slider on the fork to adapt the fork rake, and then if you slacken the head tube angle and make a smaller fork rake, for example, you can feel that. Everyone could feel that. And there we were like, okay, head tube angle shouldn't be too slack, otherwise you feel like on a tractor. If you're lower to around 71.5 to 70 or 69.5, that's a range you can adapt to and still have a pretty nice agile feel. And then the fork rake really has to be on point, otherwise it doesn't feel good. And with this prototype that I just said, we had the chance to do this fork rake slider thing, and there we came out at 56 millimeters of fork rake, which is, for in our understanding, perfect for Grail and Grizzle.
DT Swiss did some testing to quantify the bump force absorption of the fork and compare it to a rigid fork using both 40 millimeter and 50 millimeter tires. Spoiler alert, suspension works. To quantify the effect of a hard-edged bump, DT Swiss outfitted a front hub with strain gauges to measure force and direction of force. They measured backwards force because, they said, it was impossible to eliminate the effect of rider input on vertical movement. The findings? The fork both more than doubled the energy absorption of the tires and more quickly returned to neutral than the tires did alone. Now, you don't have to stare at these charts too long to start thinking, maybe suspension is the way to go on gravel. The fork weighs 1,340 grams, and although official clearance is 50 millimeters, it can fit 2.2s. There are 9 clicks of rebound adjust in the air-sprung fork. Now, the feel is obviously the most important thing about the bike, right? But how it looks, that also factors into our decision. And this is one of the cleaner forks, I think. It kind of has that integrated feel of the Cane Creek invert, the fork that's flopped upside down. It is a traditionally built fork that just has covers on either side, keeping it fairly clean looking. Cycling's all about balance, right? Or perhaps even compromise. Like, with tires. If you have a really thin tire, it's very supple and feels fantastic. It's not going to be necessarily as robust and strong as a really beefy all-weather commuter tire, which won't be as fast. Having a lot of suspension will feel great on the downhills, but you add a perhaps not trivial amount of weight on the uphills. Here, though, I didn't feel like the handling or even the weight is that greatly compromised. Which brings us to what is a bit compromised is the complexity compared to a rigid fork, which how often do you service a rigid fork? Never, right? You wash the thing. DT suggesting every 50 hours you pull this thing apart, clean it off, and then insert fresh oil and fresh oil soaked seals. If you're happy working on suspension, you do that often, you're probably thinking piece of cake. If you've never seen the inside of a suspension fork, you might be spooked. So what does that look like? Well, let's take a look here with our friend from DT Swiss.
The purpose of this service is to make sure every part is clean, there's no dirt inside, and then afterwards lubricated in the way that allows for the perfect function of the fork itself. So therefore you have the least amount of friction. As Matthias already mentioned, it's really meant for like the small gravel vibrations to take them out. So if you want to have this kind of level of performance, you also need to make sure you have the right lube at the right spot so that everything works smoothly.
If you're a lazy mechanic like I am and you don't do it every 50 hours, what degradation happens to the fork? Like what
it's hard to say because it really depends on the conditions you're riding in,
sure.
The ground. You just can expect that the oil is not, or the bushing is not too good lubricated after some amount of time if dirt would enter into the fork. So for me, the most important step is when your bike is dirty and then the mud dried, do clean the stanchion tubes very well before you do the next ride, because if you have dried up mud on the stanchion tube, it's very hard for the wiper seal to get that dirt off, so there's a bigger chance of the dirt getting pushed into the fork, and as soon as you have dirt in there, it's really not too good for the performance. So first step you do, in my recommendation, would be to be off the bike, because you could already soak the new foam rings inside the fork oil. So within your service parts, you should also have like 2 new foam rings. And to make sure they really are saturated with oil, just put them in a container. So, and then you just pour some oil over it. Make sure they are covered. So they have some time to absorb really the oil, so it stays in there. So we put them aside, and then you can start with your bike. First step, of course, remove the front wheel. Still some dirt of the Traka inside. And now we need to loosen the rebound dial, because the rebound dial is in the way of dismounting the lower. So you have a small hole on the side of the rebound dial itself, which holds just like a small tool, for example, a 1.5mm Allen key as mentioned. And then you have to loosen this screw. Oh. Sorry? No, it's a normal thread. It's a normal thread. And as you see, the red part already starts coming out. So you push it all the way out down there. First of all, now it would be recommended to have some kind of container under there, because as soon as you loosen the lower, oil drips out. So just make sure you do not lose anything. One step I almost forgot is, even though it should be kept inside, we do recommend letting out the air of the fork, so there's just like one less hazard. So you loosen the crown cover.
The air is on the right side here?
Yeah, exactly. That's because of design reasons. As Nico mentioned during the presentation, you have the rebound dial on the left side, so photos from the right side look even cleaner with the drive side on it.
It's purely for the photo.
Very important reason.
Exactly. That's only aesthetic reasons. The air cap has to be taken off. And You can do it carefully with like the top of the cap itself, or just a small tool, but to make sure that it equalizes properly, we do recommend using just a pump and letting out the air slowly. You will see it, you just have to make sure that the fork doesn't compress all the way, because then the positive and negative chamber wouldn't be equalized. So
Is there a communication port between positive and negative?
yes.
Or you can, when you pump it, you have to...
There's a small dimple inside of the stension tube that allows, if the quad ring is in the exact right position, to equalize the positive and negative chamber of these two. So you can just let out all the air. Make sure it's in open mode also for afterwards. So exactly, you can see there's no force, so it's perfectly safe. And the good thing as well is you just have to loosen the brake caliper, so you don't have to re-bleed the brake or anything. So, and now then the air is let out, the brake is out of the way, we can start to move or remove the lower. So, on the damping side, it's a 7mm hex, which you just put in. There it is a left-hand thread, so just to make sure that we tighten the bolt, or the direction of tightening. Or maybe it's just a little bit dirty, so let me just quickly clean up, because every dirt that we take away now is further away from the fork. Right, and also here at the wiper seal, it's also good to make sure there's no additional dirt. As much as you can remove now, there's less a chance of falling it into the fork. So, and the second one is a long 4mm for the air spring side. Again, normally we do have like some kind of
Maybe we can plug the two tires.
yeah.
Why is the bolt is left-handed?
Because it's threaded from the top side. So from the top
okay,
side, it's like a normal
upside down.
screw, but
Okay.
if you access this from the from the bottom,
upside down.
it's upside down. So that should be it. And now you can see, as soon as I push out, the oil comes out. In this case, yeah, it was serviced just before the race, so therefore it's almost new. If you pull it out, of course, there's not too much dirt here at the moment. Carefully, you see, you do have the dirt stuck on here of the rest of the wiper seal. It's just very little, but if you do it carefully and do not switch it to the side too quickly, you can wipe off the dirt right there, so you have less cleaning to do afterwards in the lower itself. So just take a paper towel and make sure you go around there nicely. It's not written in the manual, it's just like a tip. That's the most important part. The second most important part is here. Let me wipe them off just a little bit more so you can see it. There we do have the O-rings sealing everything towards the lower. And as you can see them, if you just pull off the lower, they're somewhat stuck, maybe a little bit square, or even remain in the lower. So you just have to make sure that you take them up the thread again to their position all the way at the top where they belong. So they're already prepared for the reinstall. Up. And throw them away. Even though these ones are still, yeah, they're basically new, just because of one race. But normally these are somewhat a little bit more dirty, and the most important part, the oil gets used from the foam ring and will be between the bushing and the fork. So therefore it's always a good idea to let them soak in the oil, as mentioned before, so they're really saturated.
So you recommend new rings whenever you do the service? Or just
I think that's the official recommendation, yeah.
Okay.
We do use some cleaner. The recommendation here is also the Swiss Clean from Motorex, and really make sure you flush out all the dirt. And then also let the cleaner evaporate so there's no remainders of that inside. you can be generous here and use also a very clean towel. Normally with one without, how do you say that?
Grease.
No, not with grease, but without the like small fibers that could get remain in there. But yeah, we have to do work with what we have at the moment. It's just not our recommendation. So you could also use compressed air, or even just soapy water works too. But there you just have to wait longer for it to evaporate and make really sure that you rinse it out with normal water without soap in it. Make sure you do not spill everything. Second one. Ooh, not a lot of air pressure left. You just take the saturated foam ring, pull it inside, and then you put it in the groove just below the wiper seal. And you have to make sure that there's no twist in it. The outside stays on the outside, and everything fits in just perfectly, because it touches the stanchion to make sure it can lubricate it. So there you have a comparison between no foam ring and the foam ring installed. So no twists inside. And most of the time I just use my oily finger and also lubricate the wiper seal just a little bit, which will show up once or twice if you compress the fork the first few times after the service, but else it remains completely sealed. So I'm really making sure that the O-rings are here in the right position to seal afterwards. And then you can slide the lower on. You have to be careful with the wiper seals so that they slide easily onto the stanchion. It's 7 mil per side. So I just pull in 14 milliliters of oil. Now you see the fork is slightly pointed upwards so the oil doesn't flow back out. And you also have to make sure that the spring units and the damping unit do not stick out already, because you could push on the lower already all the way, but then it would be hard, for example here, to put in the oil. So just take the lower off a little bit, insert the syringe, and make sure you can put the oil in just between those two inside of the lower. So 7 mil on that side. And also 7 on the other side. So, and now we're already prepared to put everything back together. Now again, left-hand thread, so I have to go to the left, turn it left. Now also for the spring unit, do the same. So. Now for this step, the torque rating is 8 Newton meters per side, which I have to eyeball at the moment because our left-hand side torque wrench already went back to Switzerland, to be honest. Just push it in there with some kind of tool. Make sure it's fully seated so you can see the adjustment. If I push it down a little bit, is in its place, so you can really dial from the side. And ne passt. So you have to adjust the rebound setting either way. We do recommend using a little bit of Loctite on that screw, or else, because it's not too much torque with this small thread. And then the fork is back together, so it's just a part of putting on brakes again, front wheel, and everything like that.
Okay, thanks very much.
It was a pleasure.
The Traka 100 had just about everything thrown into that course in 100 kilometers. Big open roads that we were swarming right side to left side at the start. Some steep climbs where, yes, I was happy to have a lockout so I could leverage my carcass over the bars trying to get up those 16, 17, 18% climbs. And then we saw those same gradients on dirt when the rain was coming down. It was getting pretty slippy. On the Schwalbe G1 RS, a tire you guys know I love. No, it's still a matter of like finding just the right sweet spot on the saddle to have traction going up these 17, 18% grunts. GRX Di2 2x, I was definitely bottoming out on that on those steeper pitches. Talking to some of the European journalists here, they're saying that Shimano has a little bit more spec on mid-range and higher-end bikes here in Europe than they do in the US, where SRAM has got a, I don't want to say dominant position, but they have a large amount of spec on the bikes at the mid-range and higher you're seeing. Anyhow, I'm happy to have a lot of range. I was also happy to have a 2x to be able to go from big gear going downhill to seeing a super steep kicker on the other side, just drop it in the small ring and spin, or in my case, slowly pedal up the other side in a small ring. Another thing I was happy to have on this guy, dual-sided power meter. That is not a Shimano thing, that is a Canyon specification with 4 eyes. So I brought my trusty Favero Osiamo pedals, but this bike, at least at this price point, comes with the dual-sided power meter. But aside from the super steep paved climbs, when I wanted every little bit of leverage I could get, I didn't feel the need to lock out the fork. You know, rolling on the gravel roads, when you're in the pace line, you can't always see things coming up. And so just having a little bit of extra give was something that felt like a luxury. Similarly, on the little single track sections, not that technical, but still you're hitting stuff, or at least I was hitting stuff that I wasn't necessarily seeing. So it just gave me a nice bit of confidence and forgiveness. For reference, my bias is somewhat anti-suspension on gravel bikes. Not that I'm against the concept, but just that my experience has been less than stellar with many of the bikes. For instance, Giant Revolt. Love how this bike feels. Giant Revolt X, the front suspension version, do not like that at all. It goes from being a stable but still lively feeling bike in the rigid version to a sluggish, kind of wheel floppy, heavy version in the Revolt X suspension model. The last suspension gravel bike I rode was the new Cannondale Topstone. You can look in the video description for a link to that, down in Texas at the Valley of Tears. That was the first event back since I damaged my shoulder, and I was happy to have a suspension fork there, or albeit it's a one-tined suspension fork, just for some of the washboard and, you know, not mountain bikey territory, but just kind of rough terrain. So that was one in the positive column for me for gravel suspension. This I feel like is even a step further up. The Lefty has a lockout, but you've got to reach down and mess with that. That was not something I was doing with my thick gloves on, with a still tender and non-functional arm, and yeah, rough terrain. To sum up, here's some things I love, things that bug me. Things I love, how the thing feels, both when locked out, when riding on pavement, and when riding it open, both on rougher terrain and even on pavement or just fairly tame gravel roads. Love the feel of the thing. I love the fact that there is a lockout that is accessible from any hand position on the bike. You're not having to reach down to hit that. I love the looks of it. As far as suspension forks go, I think this is the best looking of the bunch. They're up in the neighborhood with the Cane Creek invert. I love the fact that it doesn't change the geometry, not only not adding stack and height to the bike, but it doesn't change the head tube angle, and it doesn't change the fork rake, so it still feels the way Canyon's engineers intended the bike to feel. Things that bug me. The fact that DT, in its meticulousness, is suggesting it needs an overhaul every 50 hours. That, to my taste, as a lazy mechanic, is maybe not a bridge too far, but seems a little excessive. And like, you know, changing the oil in your car, yes, you can drive your car more than your car mechanic may suggest between oil changes. It's just going to degrade the performance. Lastly, availability and price. Those are more gray area things. Canyon has an exclusive on this through the end of 2025. The price will add approximately 1,500 euros to the bike price, and perhaps about the same for the US price. US prices for many bike companies now are quite a bit in flux, and as of early May when I'm filming this, Canyon does not yet know what its US price will be. That's thanks, or no thanks I should say, in part to the Trump administration's tariffs that are hitting the bike industry pretty hard right now, so don't have an exact price on that. In some ways it could be cool to have a lever control the lockout. You know, it could work with a mechanical lever, but then it would look a little janky to have an electronic shifter on the right hand and a mechanical on the left, but you know, that could get rid of this push control, what DT Swiss is calling a push control lever there on the drop. It's routed internally, so you still have a nice clean look up front, and then pops out just behind, underneath the fork crown down there.
Hello. Mix, please.
You need anything?
Legs, you know.
Legs?
Fountain of youth.
Yeah.
Yeah. No.
You're good. You're good.
No.
You got it.
Thanks for the treat, man.
As for the Traka, I enjoyed about 90% of it, which, as far as gravel races go, is a pretty high percentage. You know, there's always a part or parts of the course at any gravel race that's going to make you question why you're doing this silly event. And for me, some of the greasiest, steepest downhills when people were zooping past on either side, those were the parts for me in the negative column. But on the whole, yeah, I had a blast. So fun to ride with people from all over, meet people from all over, laugh together, complain together, and then high five there in the park at the finish. So let me know your thoughts on this new DT Swiss 132-1 40mm gravel suspension fork. Let me know what questions you have. I'll do my best to answer those in the comments below. Whether you like your bike suspended or rigid, I hope you can get out there and enjoy the ride.
Oops. Give me my bike back, Bush. You can't have it. It's mine. Heads up. I just put myself in the bush back there.